Welcome to In Focus with Ejaz Haider. Our top story today is about the call given by UN Secretary General for reconfiguring the economic and distribution paradigm. Speaking at the Nelson Mandela annual lecture, Antonio Guterres had this to say, and I quote, "COVID-19 has been likened to an X-ray, revealing fractures in the fragile skeleton of the societies we have built. It is exposing fallacies and falsehoods everywhere. The lie that free markets can deliver health care for all. The fiction that unpaid care work is not work. The delusion that we live in a post-racist world. The myth that we are all in the same boat. Because while we are all floating on the same sea, it's clear that some are in super yachts while others are clinging to drifting debris," unquote. Strong words coming from the chief of the world body. From Joseph Stiglitz to Thomas Piketty, this is a warning many economists have been giving for the past 2 decades. You just cannot have a system which presents the narrative of free market and meritocracy but has inequalities built into it. It is simply unsustainable. To discuss this further, we have with us Dr. Ali Cheema, an eminent economist and associate professor at the Lahore University of Management Sciences. We also have with us Vicky, Pryce, former joint head of the United Kingdom's Government Economic Service and author of Women versus Capitalism. We will also be joined shortly by Dr. Nadeemul Haque, Vice Chancellor, Pakistan Institute of Development Economics and former Deputy Chairman, Planning Commission of Pakistan. Let me begin with Dr. Cheema. Ali, you heard what the UN chief has said. The current economic distribution model is unsustainable. Some top economists have been saying this for almost 15 or more years. But this is not just an economic problem, it is also a socio-political problem. Is it possible to have a grand policy which can reframe the existing system?
Ejaz, you're absolutely right. What the UN chief is saying is not new. It's something some economists have been talking about for more than 2 decades now, that inequality is a massive global problem and we need to take this challenge squarely and seriously. Let me kind of paint before you the scale of the challenge by drawing on the historical experience of the US. So in the US in 1810, which is close to the emergence of full-blown free market capitalism, the top 10% of wealth holders controlled about 60% of the wealth. 100 years later in 1910, their share of wealth had actually increased to 80%. So that's the massive potential of free market capitalism to create enormous amounts of inequality in society. Now in the US, inequality actually started to decline post World War I, and this was also something that started to happen in Europe, which followed a similar trajectory over time to the US. And that kind of decline in inequality kept happening all the way up till 1970, when the basic framework which caused the decline of the inequality was actually eroded by ideologies like Thatcherism and Reaganism, and then inequality has been rising since. So the challenge or the specter of inequality has again become a huge problem. When you talk about grand policy, I think one of the things we can very easily do is go back and look at the period in which we have experienced decline in inequality within the capitalist framework, and from countries which are much more equal. And if you look at the period between 1914 and 1970, or you look at economies or countries like Scandinavia, which are much more equal, what you see is that the frameworks that were set up weren't just redistributing cash to the poor, but what they were doing is that they were committed to building endowments of health and education universally within their citizenry. And I think that was an important precept, and that at the heart of it was basically the state, whether as a financier or actually as a provider, of basically ensuring universal access to healthcare and the education endowment at a minimum acceptable quality level for the citizenry. And that, of course, was underpinned by a fiscal compact that ensured that this happened. it's exactly this essential component of the social welfare state that Reaganism and Thatcherism have done away with. The second big principle was that the state's big goal was to ensure that economies actually created not only full employment, but also created a ladder which enabled people with their increasing health and educational endowment to actually experience economic mobility. And again, what's been happening, and this is much more a global problem, is huge disruption in high-skilled jobs. So what that's doing is that the economic venue of economic mobility is no longer that robust. And the state's framework, which ensured universal access to equitable health and education endowment, has been eroded. And it's really in this framework that we see inequality rise in the past 3 decades.
That's a good overview, Ali. I asked about a grand policy because Piketty reasons in his Capital and Ideology only by adopting a transnational perspective can we hope to understand the current narratives and find an alternative. Now, given geopolitical tensions among states, we've seen this whole climate thing, there are a number of other issues. Is it really possible to have such a transnational perspective, or have the tools for that matter, for its implementation, even if we could indeed have such a perspective?
Ejaz, I don't think it's only about transnational policy. I think we want to have a policy focus on mitigating inequality at the local level, at the national level, in our case, even at the provincial level, because we're a federation, and then at the regional level, and then at the kind of transnational or sort of international level. And we have to have mechanisms, basically, which deal with different aspects of the inequality problem that fall within the domain of these different levels of units. So, if you're talking about sort of unequal access to sanitation and water, a lot of the times that can be a local or a regional problem. Equalizing that has to be something that falls within the domain of local governments and local communities, or regional governments and regional communities. And you have to have a state framework of kind of political institutions that can govern basically these problems for that particular unit. But yes, they are going to be problems which are sort of cross-national and regional, or cross-national and international. Problems related to pandemics, which we have recently experienced. Problems related to pollution, which in the cities that you and I both live in, Lahore, we experience every winter. And those are basically problems that don't fall or remain within national boundaries, but they are problems that cross national boundaries. So you need cross-border cooperation. Similarly, the whole issue of sort of having tax havens and places where you can actually get huge tax breaks if you have capital is going to create international capital flight for countries that require basically the tax income to be able to deal with problems of climate and environment and local sanitation and water and healthcare and education. So in some sense, there has to be frameworks at each of these levels which talk to each other, and they are built around the objective or the purpose of creating equitable societies. And they recognize this as an important principle of cooperation. Now, when you talk about, how is this possible at an international level because, of conflicts between states, And this kind of comes back to a question you asked me earlier, which I actually didn't address at that particular point. It is a political economy issue. So, we know that interests of states or state elites, or the perception of what a problem is by state elites, can be very different from the problems as they're perceived by citizens, or the problems experienced by citizens. So state elites might say, oh, all we need is wealth and the security that enable us to produce wealth. But for a citizen who doesn't have a share in that wealth, that's not going to be the main problem. That citizen's problem will be the problem of existence for himself and his family and his community. So those are breakdowns that happen. So just recognizing the principle may not be enough. You have to then have governance institutions and political institutions that allow the participation and representation of a broad set of interests that can be debated within national and international frameworks to ensure that the creation of that just framework is driven by the voice of the many and not the few.
Well, that's precisely the problem, Ali. The vertical sort of, inequalities within the states, and horizontally or laterally, the geopolitical issues and, conflictual models within the state. But let me get to my final question and, let me quote Piketty again. What he says is that inequality in the pre-modern eras was justified by functional complementarity of different social groups. And modern inequality narrative is about winners and losers in a freely chosen process, a process of meritocracy. Clearly, that seems to hide, as I said earlier also, the discriminatory practices in reality. How can those practices, status, race, religion, etc., be changed, and by whom?
There's a long historical tradition where the rich have justified inequality on the grounds that it is kind of necessary to ensure poverty reduction. It's rare that a rich guy will publicly come out and say, I don't care about poverty, or I am not contributing through wealth creation to the reduction of poverty. And sometimes it can be true, but there's a basic premise there, and that basic premise is that basically they're talented and able people, and they're people who lack ability and talent. And the society we want to create is the society that unleashes the ability of the talented to create wealth. And by doing that, they're going to create a wave that lifts all boats in society. But what recent evidence has actually shown is that the difference in mobility, economic mobility or social mobility that we see over time, or the gain in wealth that goes to some communities and some individuals, is not because they're more talented than others. They just have better opportunities. So there is inequality of opportunities, and inequality of opportunities is not just about jobs, but it's being able to get healthcare, and it's about getting education, and it's about developing or being born and raised in an environment that gives you confidence and that gives you a sense of achievement, as opposed to basically being in an environment where you feel that you're going to fail and that you just don't have or it kind of ingrains a lack of confidence in you, despite the fact that you have talent. And there's a tremendous amount of evidence on this now. So I think the notion of kind of a functionalist approach to the justification of inequality is a problem. And it doesn't provide us with a solution. It does one more thing, which I think is really erode the basic precept of universalism, which is to create the argument for inequality reduction in terms of individual gain. I think we can't make progress on inequality till we really think about, or we develop an ethos about contributing to a just society or a just community. And that is a social contract, or that is an important part of the social contract that has to emerge for societies to develop frameworks that can effectively deal with the specter of inequality.
Thank you. That was Dr. Ali Cheema speaking with us. Let me go to Vicky Pryce here. Ms. Pryce, do we need to redefine, since we're talking about reconfiguring the economic distribution models, do you think that in order for us to do that, we first have to redefine the idea of growth itself?
Well, it's interesting because you've just had this discussion, which are fascinating. If you look at the comments made by the Secretary General of the United Nations, who spoke about the issue of inequality that already exists at the top of our organizations, so the international organizations such as the United Nations Security Council, such as the World Bank possibly, such as the International Monetary Fund. What he was arguing is that you have the problem there in terms of who is exercising the power and whether the poorer, less developed nations are actually having the right voice and are able to get the right support which they need. Indeed, I think there is an issue about whether the system is at present delivers some of the benefits that many of these countries would like to see happen. And the problem is that it doesn't. The system doesn't result in the type of, as you said in your introduction, healthcare that everybody wants and the equality that everybody really yearns for. But of course, the issue is to a considerable extent within countries. We must remember that, yes, of course, inequality actually was reduced for a while after the Second World War. And that is because when there is a war, there's a crisis, even at the time of the financial crisis, even now with COVID, inequality actually gets reduced because assets get destroyed. Very quickly, the markets realize that they can compensate for it in a different way. And after a few years, possibly decades, inequality starts increasing again. And do we have a system which is able to have the checks and balances that reduces the type of inequality? And do we have institutional powers cross-country that can adjust the differences that might exist between the advanced nations and the others? And I think what he was concerned about, the UN, in that speech, is that the transfers of money even between the West, if you like, and the emerging nations is not happening at the scale that it should do, and the international institutions need to do a lot more. Having said that, both the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and then the G20, that is reasonably effective, although not as effective as we would like it to be, have all moved, including actually the creditor nation, the organizations and the private sector, have all moved to ease the burden of debt for developing countries and to ensure that certainly through this coronavirus crisis, they get extra support with debt relief, holiday in terms of the payments that they have to make on their debt and so on. And maybe that is beginning then to show that possibly international institutions can work a little bit better. But I think what we need to do is rethink the way in which our whole international structure is set to ensure that we don't end up with these huge divergences that still exist between countries.
I think that's a very smart point with reference to the UN Security Council, with reference to the World Bank, the IMF. I mean, the entire sort of, security architecture, post-World War II, security and financial architecture. But let me ask you this. If we have to reconfigure, why would the stronger states or the world elites basically accept this reconfiguration? Because this is a template that has worked for them. They're the ones, whether they're the 1%, as some economists have called, they basically take away the lion's shares, if you will, of the resources. And those who really want this template to be broken and reconfigured are the ones who do not really have the tools to actually get this done. So we basically go back to square one in terms of who's going to do it.
But what we have found is that when there are excesses, even in wealth gathering or in playing on the markets, as was done in the financial crisis, you do then find that you cannot continue to be growing and expanding as you did before. And quite a large part of that 1%, if you like, wealth then gets destroyed, as I said earlier. So it is in their interest to see it more widely spread and to see, assuming, of course, that can be done that countries elsewhere also grow and develop a market, which in themselves is good news for people in the West, because basically you are widening the ability of the middle class and to spend and to enjoy actually the types of services which the rest of the world perhaps enjoys. And we've seen that with globalization. And one of my main worries is that we may be moving away from that, partly because of coronavirus and the need to perhaps onshore more, partly because there are all these trade tensions between the US and China, which are also, of course, affecting all of us. So there is considerable worry that some of the benefits that have come to emerging markets may not be sustained for the future. But I think what we certainly need to be watching a lot more is that we can't have countries do well and become like the rest of the world has been for a while, and have their own, both voice but also power, economic power in the world, if there isn't also a basic structure in those countries which allows for the type of health support that countries need, allows for welfare support, it allows for people who stay at home or look after others to be properly remunerated for the care that they provide. And it is one of the issues that the Secretary General was talking about, that we need a new Green Deal. And talking about green, we also need to make absolutely certain with climate change, and I think all the people who've done so far will not be doing well if we have the type of catastrophe on the environmental side that people are worried about, that we do have and we do push for the commitments in terms of cash that have been made, both in terms of assisting healthcare systems, but also in terms of transferring know-how and ensuring there is mitigation in relation to the climate change threat that we have, that it actually goes and gets transferred to the most needy countries around the world, so that we can all fight this together. Without a system which ensures there is still growth in the future, then we will not actually be able, the people in the West who've done rather well out of this, or people even in other countries that have benefited very significantly from the inequalities within the emerging markets, will not be able to continue to have any of those benefits. So in reality, it's in everyone's interest for those to be considerably more widely spread than has been the case so far.
Well, that's a tall order, but thank you. That was Vicky Pryce speaking with us. We are now joined by Dr. Nadeemul Haque, who's Vice Chancellor of Pakistan Institute of Development Economics and a former Deputy Chairman of Planning Commission of Pakistan. Dr. Haque, thank you for being on the program. We're discussing what the UN Secretary General has said at the Nelson Mandela annual lecture, where he's talked about the various fault lines within the current economic and distribution paradigm. I just want to get a sense from you, because this is a warning that some of the economists, from Stiglitz to Piketty, have been giving for the last almost 15, 20 years. What exactly are we talking about here?
Just the data does show that inequality has increased, and that social mobility, which had happened in the last 2 centuries, we had seen extreme amounts of social mobility. That social mobility may be getting choked. So yes, the data is showing that, and you've seen that the immigration that took place in the last 5 decades, that immigration which fueled the growth of the Western economies has created fissures in those economies, where the indigenous populations are rebelling against the immigration. So globalization is kind of being questioned and coming to a halt. So everybody is talking about, including Donald Trump, including Boris Johnson, about a new deal. But unfortunately, we lack the intellectual wherewithal to have a new deal, because all the people that you're quoting, they are putting forward complaints, they are whining, but I don't see a Keynes emerging yet. There is no Keynes on the horizon who can mobilize the world into thinking about a new deal. At the same time, the UN itself seems to have lost legitimacy, because we've heard the UN reform being talked about for the last 30 years, and the UN has not been reformed. If anything, all the UN is doing is frustrating everybody around, and even forcing the US to leave certain UN agencies. There is a need, a crying need, to change the way the world is functioning, the way the world is organized. We need a new enlightenment. But that requires a new John Locke, a new Keynes, or somebody to come in and define the new world. I'm afraid the world suffers from a global deficit, global intellectual deficit more than anything else.
Okay, let me posit it in another way. So the narrative about the modern period is that unlike the pre-modern period where discrimination was part of functional complementarities, that here you are free to choose. The free enterprise, if you've got the entrepreneurial spirit, you should be able to go in and make it big. But what this narrative really hides, not very deftly anymore, let me add, are that there are inequalities built into this, and there is no such thing as a system where anyone can freely choose and become big. Now, it seems to me, and I'm no expert here, that the important thing is to first challenge this narrative itself, because it's deceptive.
Just the free enterprise system existed in the 19th century. Even then, it was not totally free, because if you think about it, Columbus and the American railroad movement, everything was kind of hand in glove with the government. The free enterprise system, as it is taught in the classroom, in the extreme perfect competition model, hardly ever exists in the world. In the 20th century, it was challenged, as I said, by Marx and then Keynes, and we have arrived at the welfare state, which was like a hybridization of free enterprise in the Marxist system. So nowadays, there's no such thing as a free enterprise system anywhere in the world. The whole world has a welfare system, from the US to Japan to even Pakistan. And what we are seeing, apart from the fact that it's choking opportunity, what we are seeing is also huge growth of government. In fact, there's a famous paper done by, a book done by, Tulloch, that how government has grown in the 20th century. 20th century really has been the growth of government. Government in some states now is 50-60% of GDP. Even in the US, it's 30% of GDP. In Pakistan, government could be north of 60%. That government has become unfinanceable. And we are seeing a huge rise of debt in the world. US debt, for the first time in history, has crossed 100% of GDP. Japan is sitting at 250% of GDP. That debt itself is threatening the global economy. So I think when people are just criticizing the free enterprise, they are kind of missing the bigger picture. The bigger picture is free enterprise is a part of humanity. It's like Darwin's evolution. It exists. But a lot depends on how we structure it. We do have government. We've had government for the last 10,000 years. And the structuring of the government is the most important thing that human beings have to face. We faced it in the Enlightenment. We faced it in the New Deal. Now we have to face it again. A new state is called for. Unfortunately, I think most of these thinkers are wasting their time discussing neoliberalism and not discussing the role of the government. That is where the debate should be.
Okay, the role of the government. Thank you so much. That was Dr. Nadeemul Haque speaking with us. Clearly, this is a topic which requires a lot of input. And I think, as Dr. Nadeemul Haque said, this is something that perhaps requires the experts from around the world to sit together and try and figure out how to restructure the system. In any case, we shall take a short break at this point and return to discuss Iran's decision to drop India from an ambitious gas field project in the country that had been in the pipeline for the past 10 years. Stay with us. Welcome back to In Focus. Our second story tonight is about Iran's decision to drop India from an ambitious gas field project in the country that had been in the pipeline for the past 10 years. This is what Indian journalist Maya Mirchandani has written with reference to India-Iran relations, and I quote from her: "Ever since the 2016 trilateral transport corridor agreement designed to facilitate trade and markets across the wider Central Asian region with the Chabahar port as its hub, bilateral ties between India and Iran have been tested. On one hand, by Tehran's dangling of increasing proximity with Beijing as a geostrategic challenge to India, and on the other, by Delhi's sometimes awkward balancing of relations with US President Donald Trump, even at the cost of maintaining crucial regional partnerships, unquote. Now, Iran has decided to develop the Farzad B gas field in the Persian Gulf region on its own and might engage India appropriately at a later stage. This was stated by India's Ministry of External Affairs in a statement last Thursday. Masood Karbasian, managing director of National Iranian Oil Company, told reporters that a new operator had been roped in to develop the gas field, replacing India's ONGC. To discuss India-Iran relations, we have with us Mr. Ravi Srivastav, who is an analyst and joins me from Delhi. We also have with us Ross Feingold, who's a former Asia chairman of Republicans Abroad. Thank you to both panelists. Mr. Srivastav, let me first begin with you. I think one of the problems with this whole thing has been the fact that on the one hand, India wants to have close relations with Iran, and on the other hand, since it's very close to the United States and the US has got Iran under primary and secondary sanctions, so Delhi doesn't really understand or figure out how to go about this.
In fact, India has been doing this kind of balancing act with the neighbor, a near neighbor in geopolitical area, Iran, for last almost 2 decades. If you recall that, Chinese, because of US sanctions, India was not able to proceed with Iran for quite some time, even for procurement of crude oil also, which is an essential need for India. And this Chabahar project was a 628-kilometer pipeline, which was giving away from Chabahar to Zendan in Afghanistan, was a big, advantage for India for meeting the requirements of Afghanistan and bypassing its, ever troubling neighbor, the Pakistan, and they were able to even send a supply sometimes in 2016 to Chabahar port. In Chabahar port, they were allowed 2 terminals and 5 berths over there to do it. But I feel that this is a big setback to India's diplomatic relationships with Iran, for that matter, and losing that particular project altogether. And the second blow which has come is now that with Iran, they were about to develop a field in Farzad B, where India's oil companies, Indian Oil Corporation, Oil India Limited, and ONGC had shown tremendous progress, and it would have been a big gain for India, for that matter. Even that project also has been dropped by Iran, and Iran has decided to develop it on its own, and they are entering into an agreement with China, and they're going to have almost a 10-year lease with them for $400 billion a gas project. So I think that India has to reassess their diplomatic relationship with the neighbors, and this is where they have got a major setback. As you know, that to recent Chinese incursion into the area of Galwan, Despong, and Pangong, so India has a lot of serious resentment going on within India, and they are they have already discontinued their 59 apps recently, and a lot of economic sanctions have been put on China, for that matter. They have cancelled a lot of Chinese projects going on in India, and forthcoming the investments also have been turned down, and many contracts have been cancelled. So this is where India stands with China at the moment. But I think they are paying the price by these Iranian projects going out of their hand and going in favor of China.
A couple of factual things, Mr. Srivastav. It seems that there's more than one, as you put it, troubling neighbor. It's not just Pakistan, there's China also, you just mentioned, there's Nepal, even Bangladesh is not happy, and we know how things have been with Sri Lanka. So I think there's need for New Delhi to try and reassess this. The other thing is that the rail project and the Farzad B gas pipeline thing, That has nothing to do with China. That proposed 25-year thing is still to unfold. It's somewhere in the future. That happened because of delays on the Indian side. But thank you so much for your insights for us. Let me hop over to Ross Feingold here. Mr. Feingold, what is your reading of the situation here?
Some of these decisions, of course, will come as a disappointment to India. Understandably, India wants to exercise influence in its near abroad, and that would certainly include Afghanistan, and to maintain positive relations with Iran, as we've been discussing. That's been a multi-decade project for India across different administrations, different political parties. But on the other hand, it's going to come as no surprise that in the aftermath of these decisions by Iran and the Iran-China agreement, that we're going to hear increasingly from the United States and along with Australia and to a lesser extent Japan, that the timing is right for India to deepen its relationship with a different set of partners. And whether or not India wants to do that still remains to be seen. Of course, there's been a lot of movement in that regard, and that would also represent a change for India from its past non-alignment or, as we were discussing, seeking a strong relationship.
Mr. Feingold, one of the points, historically, if we see, for a state that does not have good relations with its neighbors and does not have good relations in the region, it's very difficult to sort of, go and find new partners outside of the region. I mean, I'm not saying that you can't do that, but I think one of the things that one needs to do, any state needs to do, and we've seen this in North America, we've seen this in Europe and elsewhere, that you really need to have some kind of influence within the region. And I think that's where these Iranian decisions have been a major setback for India.
It's an excellent point, but we have to balance that against a number of other factors. One is just simply the size of India, with a large population and a growing economy, obviously a substantial military power as well, that there are willing partners, even if they are geographically distant, like Australia, Japan, and the United States. But if India wants to seek those partnerships, the interesting thing is, and whether China likes it or dislikes it, or Iran likes it or dislikes it, there are willing partners with these Western countries in Japan right now, which introduces a very different element from the past decades, the Cold War, the immediate aftermath of the Cold War.
Yeah, well, so are you suggesting, and this is the final question before I wrap up, are you suggesting that India has finally decided, or should finally decide, that it basically, in order to balance China, should be squarely in the US camp and part of the Quad that you also referred to?
Well, yeah, that's something that from the American perspective, and again, a lesser extent from Australia and Japan perspective, they would like to see happen. But whether the current government in India wants to go that far, it's a decision for the Indian government and parliamentarians and ultimately the public in India. And this is a work in progress. We're going to be talking about this for many months and possibly years to come to see just how deep those relationships go.
Okay. Thank you so much. That was Ross Feingold speaking with us. This is all from In Focus tonight. We shall see you tomorrow at the same time. Meanwhile, keep following us on social media at indus.news. Good night and goodbye.